Hello everyone, today we start a new era of powerful technical means as I have decided on the basis of your grievances, your cahier de doléances, so to say, to update at least my mic. I used a pretty old one that I had also salvaged with, greatly concerted effort from an actual headphone mic that, however, worked fantastically, at least in the way the volume and the cleanness of the sound was concerned. Unfortunately, however, there was a bit this echo sound connected probably with some magnetic interference that some of you in particular were capable of listening pretty strongly. I honestly listened to my videos with this is after I entered I heightened the volume compared to the older days and also passed a denoiser track, I think, here instead. This is really the first time I record. I will not pass any filter whatsoever because it's a nice mic, nothing particularly expensive or anything, but it's exactly fine for sort of having a louder voice, a cleaner track in this sense, and minimizing the background noise that is always there and possible. Of course, I don't know if you can hear the chair creaking anyway. This is just a test video, or at least it has nothing to do actually with the test. I decided just to try the new device by simply making the usual video, the next one from the cycle at this point, which is about the, if you want, the theological implications of lay authority in, say, full medieval Germany, say between the 11th and the 13th centuries. By the way, the older mic will be religiously preserved as a veritable relic because we got to 25,673, I read. No, 74, just in this instant. It's a sign. Subscribers, just for that. Probably if I had used a better mic at this point, we may have been at 50,000. In any case, it's still a vessel of the Imperium, and as such, we will treasure him for his inherent power acquired in the process. Anyway, as always, we don't know what the future brings. In any case, maybe you will not like this microphone, which I doubt because I'm actually stopping. You don't know the highly crafted editing process behind Schwerpunkt's audio track and, of course, the video editing. You can see what deep effort I make to edit my videos, but I'm actually stopping here and there, as I usually do whenever I misspell something or I just want to think better about what I want to say. And I'm listening. I think it's a nice track. I think it's a nice sound. It's really a microphone calibrated for this kind of crafting one way to another. So let's inaugurate this era with a beautiful topic that at some point we already addressed. Of course, talking about medieval Germany in a bit, the foundations, the premises of the German monarchic power. Recently, as you know, I commented on a Kings and Generals video, essentially addressing the vexata question of why was medieval Germany so fragmented, at least at a certain point in history, compared to some other polities. And there we also mentioned the old series I made last year about princely Germany, and we will keep talking about probably the depths of German politics, institutions, and authority, because it's one of those evergreen topics that, however, do not really, at least in a historiographical sense, that, however, do not get too much attention when it gets to pop culture, because in many ways, people think it's either boring or they think it's basically undermining the ideal picture of the empire for what it was. And again, it's not really like that. And these videos help us, if anything, understand how and why, like the empire really had this course of action. So to say, we talked about the German royal fisc months ago, which is an importantly interconnected topic. We talk, of course, a lot about the relation between the empire and the church, which is so fundamental. But let's look at a bit of the premises for lay power as well. I hinted at the underlying sort of metaphysical issue in that video about the Germanic imperial Catholic miracle that addresses how, especially the Franks, managed to establish this, to re-establish better this awareness of the direct contact between sort of men as the detainers of the imperium in a if not a non-coercive, at least a non-formalistic way, right? The idea that somebody will take care of things like a state of bureaucracy, whatever, without any kind of force injected in the individual power holders is definitely a problem that you can observe, in fact, also in the Byzantine world, etc. So the Latin Germanic West had historically more of this notion of peerage to at a nobiliar level that entailed very different relations. Non-legalistic one for how important law was in the Latin Germanic world, and that in fact we tend to forget exactly on a religious basis, right? The fact that at the origin, I don't think many of you studied medieval law just per se. I did. It was one of my I think I can say favorite, but sort of more interesting university classes, and I sort of recollected my university work for, in fact, making. I stopped, I think, last year to make like properly a series on medieval law in some depth, in some detail. Naturally, we'll come back on it. And the point being that nobody really presents you this legal history in traditional terms, or at least they tell you, well, basically the Germans came as a standard pack, they had these laws, we're talking the early Middle Ages, also because tendentially the historians of law tend to brutally separate between the Roman world and the Germanic one without understanding that also Roman law, as we intended, is more like a late antique product rather than the originally Roman law. It was in fact pretty much the same of this other Indo-European populations in terms of recognition of nobiliar value and individual force, and you know that in the relations during the so-called Republic of the various nobiliar clans really passed through that original idea of imperial power holders. I also recently made a video about the Numina and how also, in fact, those who performed the sacred rites of the Ars Regia were truly understood as people that could basically not even fit any kind of earthly, especially must not fit any kind of earthly boundary, because those who enacted this power were by definition to be conferred a degree of autonomy. So today we'll not look specifically at this and the path to full medieval Germany, so to say, but we observe it from this particular perspective that has to do also with lots of stuff. Today we will make not so many examples, but we'll talk about, I don't know, Conrad II's, Henry IV's times, like, so we're talking mostly, even since Charlemagne or Otto I, but mostly in centuries like the 11th to 12th that, as we've seen, were really shattered the German monarchy in its public foundations because of the essential defeat during the investiture controversy, the privatization of and really feudalization of episcopal investitures as well, especially after Worms 1122. We recently discussed this in our videos, but surely we will talk more about the power of the nobility in Germany in this game, all right? Because it always seems as if, you know, it's the Pope excommunicates this guy, the guy's, the emperor gets triggered by it, descends to Italy, and it's basically a matter between the two. But as a matter of fact, there were many different, not just the canonic sort of kingdoms of the Holy Roman Empire, but also other powers outside were involved in this view of the imperium. And the German nobility played an important role that also at a provincial level is, in fact, to be browsed in quite, in fact, precise terms because, again, of the complexity of this land that we were highlighting also in the recent video commentary, Kings and Generals. Excuse me, I drink a little. Feel free in the comments to tell me anything about the audio. If you like it, if you dislike it, whatever. I can't go back to the other one, but this is better. Now, alongside the active support of the church, imperial authority relied heavily on the management of the imperial treasury. However, detailed information on this process remains scarce until the Hohenstaufen era. That's why I made that video about the German royal fisc, because the question is, in an elective monarchy, as it already was way before, as you know, the Golden Bull, etc., ever since the beginning of the monarchy, and considering the sort of migratory path that the various royal houses had in terms of provincial location, like what was like a court, a German court in the centuries, like even from a documentary point of view, like if we want to study, of course, this is another question, but in general, like you would imagine that these courts, by being itinerant, would also carry with them substantial amount of documents. They would have a library or an administrative system. And unfortunately, we know a few about them, as it's normal also for other countries, like the French were also historically quite itinerant, not as much as the Germans by this point, but of course there was, as I was saying before, just a lot of non-statalized profile, these monarchies that mostly relied on very standard feudal private power of the same royal families and their domains and their assets. All right, so documenting the management of the imperial treasury is a bit of a challenge. In the Swabian era, we start getting, of course, more information because Germany is essentially modernizing along the pattern of Western Frankish, the Western Frankish monarchy, the Western Frankish royal administration, or just to core feudal system, because up to this point, Germany had taken a bit longer to literally take off as with that amount of wealth and power of the single feudal principalities, etc. We're not to discuss this even in particular today, because again, these are all chapters that I will cover at some point, right? They're even, say, as niche as they may sound, but if you want to have a clear picture of medieval Germany, you must be aware of them. But of course, during the Hohenstaufen era, you are also in a time where, like from the mid-12th century, we have just more information. You have more documents. You have, even indirectly, a much greater amount of information concerning the imperial administration. Within such an extensive territory like Germany and its dependencies, imperially wise, that again are a huge, a vast area of Europe, the emperor as the landholder, because we will get to this now, but this is what technically by the Romano-Germanic standards still, and especially also in the Hohenstaufen era that was reviving heavily Roman law, was in theory the owner of literally everything. The emperor was recognized as, in fact, the supreme lord as well as magistrate, right, over also all those dependent on the manors, towns, and fortifications, as well as vassal knights with their fiefs, right? The sense was that in terms of lay power, as we'll see now with the church is another story, but basically everything, publicly speaking, belonged to the emperor. There wasn't such a thing like, this is not just about Germany, this is really how, and we've explained it in the video about medieval law, the system had sort of developed from, right? In spite of the fact that, as we mentioned before, since the Merovingian era, there was more sort of chivalric, feudal reinjection of sense of individual liberty of essentially also the great powerful noblemen. Then, of course, average people lost at large, probably even the same freemen, great part of their liberty, as you know, in the process. But this hierarchy, this topic we'll come back on today very much, was recognized as a natural consequence of deriving again from the merit of these individuals, how much power they own, how much Holy Ghost / Imperium they had received from God in order to rule over certain people or certain lands within, however, a system that nobody said, like, this is actually, that where anyone was thought to own something in absolute terms, because even just in theological terms, he who controlled over everything, having the power, at least in principle, to affirm itself just ipso facto on these subjects that recognize him as a leader, could not technically be anyone's, right? The concept of property in traditional terms is quite controversial, because property is in earthly terms what, as fallen humans, we decided to have a law to recognize, right, and to try to keep enforced, because in theory, like divine wise, like power is just exercise on things. Even if you do not legally own something, you still have some control on it, right? And people have control on other people, and the hierarchy functions exactly in this way. So in line of principle, it was accepted in part in this sense also in the wake of the Roman tradition that was very solidly statal and very, very authoritatively public, that the Germanic kings had, at least, especially those within the Romano-Germanic tradition, a control on the entirety of what was effectively recognized as the public domain, right? It was properly, like, if it's not just a matter of like somebody dies, there are no heirs, so the public authority inherits everything. This is very well documented in the Romano-Germanic legislation. This is technically, there were vast amounts of land, mainly like those estates, for example, had been devolved for the army, supplies, etc. This was very strongly evident in Gaul, right, when the Franks took over, etc. That were public land and were recognized as such. Also, the Church of Rome fundamentally ended up overlapping with was the lay public domain, right? This is very, very famous, very, very much evident in the case, again, of the Church of Rome, not only. The Church is another story. As you know, the Church does not belong to any earthly domain. It's the Church of God, and anything that, of course, is, however, administered by the clergy, yes, does intertwine with imperial authority. It should be, in a fully ideal sense, subject entirely to imperial authority, and it technically is, as much as, the emperor has a capacity to interact with these people. But as you know, the struggle between regnum and sacerdotium is so complicated that they needed to have an investiture controversy in it, and of course us to have hundreds of videos on the topic. And we'll surely come back on that if you're interested, especially in this sort of ideal, right, absolute divide. I suggest you to check out that video I made about the Sutri Agreement. That is really telling about that moment in which, in order to essentially sign a truce, a peace between the papacy and the empire for the respective sort of interests, there was a declaration whereby, in theory, like really the temporal and the spiritual dimension were separated. Then this, of course, brought to nothing, because you can't simply surpass the human condition in that intertwinement. But just to say how strongly alive this concept was, especially during that period. Today we talk about bishops as well, and any other ecclesiastical authority in terms of that feudalization we were talking about before, especially after Worms. This technically already existed, meaning the fact that the bishops were seen as a secular power, which they technically are also within the church, because they literally administrate communities. At some point, as you know, they had substituted themselves to the empire, and they had de facto, been always there in that hybrid between a temporal and a secular authority. Like, even the emperors technically were, right? Because, again, we'll have to make more history of religion videos explaining what pertains to whom, but again, in a human sense, and not because of the fall, but because of the divine, origin, you will always have in life both powers simultaneously provided, let's say, in not necessarily a directly proportional way, or at least there can be different outcomes, contemplative or active. Let's say the way the Imperium manifests is another story. That would be sort of more leveled on the basis of the same amount of power, so to say. But here we talk about lay power, and as such, bishops, in the moment in which they were invested literally of a fief belonging to public authority, not to the church, as it happened, again, particularly after the conquered date of Worms. I made an entire video explaining this, are to be counted together with counts, untitled nobles, margraves, abbots, as well dukes, that controlled land and were acknowledged as lords of their own followers, wielding essentially in practice, and this was the problem in Germany as well as in many other countries, a great deal of de facto power. In fact, one comparable to the same emperor. As a matter of fact, there was a strong iron arm during the civil wars and investiture controversy, and just even without that highlighted the problem that the German king fundamentally would never control, even formally, in a public sense, everything in a direct fashion, right? This is, after all, the feudal age. It would have not been possible to begin with. But in Germany, this problem was very pronounced because of the historical difficulty of even having proper feudalism getting started, and having all these various ethnic chunks of the Eastern Frankish kingdom being very loosely connected, especially at the beginning of this period, with one another, and of course exploiting that, especially in resisting the application, when not the imposition, of a royal authority. This seigneurial perspective on lordship, where each lord maintained dependent rights within the hierarchical system, predates manorialism in Germany. In fact, it can be traced back to the pre-Carolingian period. This was completely normal, again, in the Romano-Germanic world. Whoever is, again, under someone is a subject, whoever is above someone is a lord. And in many ways, these power struggles were always ideologically fueled by a notion that you are what you are. Like, there is never a moment in your life in which you are where you do not deserve. The intense debate was, of course, on how to achieve this. The ultimate purpose of the empire, like, going back to the one, unifying the world, and allowing, in fact, for that salvation that with the divine help is at hand through whomever. In this sense, also the papacy as the vicary of Christ on earth, the emperor as also a medium of victory, are wielding complementary, but not overlapping powers. The problem was rather how to achieve this. Right, so what policies to follow, and in essence, how much what was going on was, in fact, an upwards growth or a downwards spiral, human degeneration towards nothingness. Because the idea is that as a human, at least as a human, as a non-divine, everything that you do is, because of course there is a transfigurational power, a transcendental one. Nothing that you do, even by augmenting and succeeding in augmenting your own, in fact, transcendental power, is devoid of sin. actually you must sin to a degree in order, exactly as a human, to transcend that. We've seen this in many videos, from knightly psychology to religious tradition, etc. That is kind of obvious. It's inherent, our current condition. Although the emperor was considered the lord of the empire in disguise, each nobleman governed his household and its fortifications, commanding an armed retinue, as well as individuals, including serfs, who depended on him. So, through him as a medium, this was also the point, was he really the medium? Did he really wield the entire power existing on Earth? Evidently not, right? This is the great sort of the generation from Roman times that continues by prophetic tradition. This is true for every power out there. And so part of the struggle was, for example, like who would, for example, would become emperor at the same time, especially when the emperor is communicated. You have anti-kings, etc., that are literally saying, I'm actually God's chosen one. And as such, I do not really fit that hierarchy. I had one on my own. I'm actually the only medium with God. Let's leave aside again the papal issue. And as such, you could see so many different German princes thus escaping imperial authority. Not just German ones, but still within the German kingdom, even from the local monarch. Now, this principle provided a theoretical basis for the same regional autonomy within Germany and motivated the same efforts to defend it. After all, it had been, as we've seen, historical. Germany had come into being in a very difficult, very brutal, and in part also very effective way, and successful one. There is no doubt about this. But through, in fact, the coagulating efforts, so to say, of the same monarchy that started from essentially a provincial basis. Think about Henry the Fowler. Everybody, that's a good example, right? We'll keep talking about him soon, but made some videos describing what was Germany at the end, eventually, of Carolingian power. You start, like, as all the major houses in Germany, they do not really start like in England or France, also as simply installing themselves in the center of power of a pre-existing state. The state in Germany is to be properly put together to begin with. And that's also part of the reason why there are different houses ruling from different parts of the country across the centuries. And also in pretty wild fashion, like it's that you have in Carolingian times Bavaria as the center, then you have Saxony during the Ottonians, the Salians have Franconia, the Hohenstaufen have Swabia. So and it changes, keeps changing from Austria to Bohemia, etc. So this is like such an important aspect that I may have even stressed further in that video about kings and generals, but again, if you are interested in my medieval Germany content, just know that I have a pretty hefty playlist about medieval Germany that basically deals with specifically this kind of institutional issues, because I think they're among the most important ones. I think I should talk more about late medieval Germany, which we do in part, but it's not that often as this one, but this is such an important knot, such a foundational moment in general. And here, let's search for, this is the 120th video about medieval Germany, so you can, I made more videos about medieval Germany than medieval France, so to say. So there is always some sort of interesting insight on whatever part of the period. Naturally, this one is resolutive because much of that aforementioned sort of fragmentation of Germany as we perceive it in later historical times stems from this very era. Right, this is the moment, and we tend again to, in my opinion, I'm of that there is a historiographical debate actually about this, because some scholars say, well, up to the 11th to 12th century, 13th century, there wasn't really nothing in Germany that was so different from, say, England or France regarding, the development of a monarchy. Really? Really? They were very different countries, not just for the post-Roman issue, but literally on the institutional basis and premises on which they had been historically founded, right? Even the geographical dimension, that, as you know, I'm not that great fan of deterministically pushing at all, but can self-evidently play a role. They're vast spaces, they're not as populated as others. There are also pretty dangerous neighbors, but we say it's a completely different reality, and this will affect the chances of the German unification attempts, at least. Now, from an ideological standpoint, the empire symbolized a worldly reflection of a hierarchical lordship that spanned both the celestial and terrestrial realms. Nobody at the time thought really that heaven and earth were hypostatically separated. This is not even what Christianity ever said. On the contrary, if anything, it's the other way around. It may be a more tendentially punctiform way, but in such lowly, modern, and secularized lands like the German ones, think about the St. Ghibelline ideology, the sense that this imperium, so as properly divine grace bestowed on the triumphing hero, was essentially the only purpose, like to accomplish in one's life, was very prepotently on the fore, right? In part, it stemmed, in fact, from that level of anarchy and lack of regulation that the German monarchs have to routinely cope with, and trying to impose rather, and that in fact gradually does take shape. Like Germany will fully fit the ancien regime, sort of late medieval political and social regulation, but even at that point, again, in a way that had mirrored this previous dispersion of power, at least in great difficulty in putting it together, and even with this enormous leonine power that is really exemplified. I mean, think about figures like Frederick Barbarossa, just for how they were, but in a deeper sense, being embodied by local lords that had, in the sense, they were more morally loaded as less materially loaded, endowed, really. And this is a bit like the history of the world, right? And there is a reason if the system really collapses at a point, right? Collapses also much because, again, it had great power to use, but this lack of basis for making it more politically cohesive and sort of formally unitary, let's say, in an institutional administrative way. And in part, again, the emperors did choose right in trying to centralize from Southern Europe rather than from Germany, that, especially for a good half, was really nothing that was worth investing on in the bigger universal picture. Now, the sense is that the Holy Trinity protected the system. The Trinity's name was really pronounced in imperial letters issued from the Chancery, reflecting the centrality of this ideology. There are people who are surprisingly still wondering what the Trinity really is, and it has to do exactly with that divine transfigurational achievement. There is a heavenly nature that you can call God in a proximate sense, and then you have the fallen world that keeps sort of degenerating as an impression of the truer, the perennially true higher nature. And you have, in this sense, in the lower world, certain figures that, being still albeit fallen, endowed with a spark of divinity, that struggle to salvage all this fallen world and making it back to the one. And this can happen only through the Holy Ghost, right? Of course, naturally, God is Father, in a deep, also virile, ungenited way, and the Son is to rise at the same level through the Holy Ghost, through this power that is bestowed from heaven on those who succeed in fact, bringing things back together. So it's an immediate instantiation of power. And as we've seen recently, also in the video about the Numina, but also the one about sacred royalty, there is a perennial struggle that earthly leadership is required to perform in order to even hope to save anyone, right? And again, I will not explain how this, imperium and sacerdotium mix, that had been a split at this point, and this is part of the human degeneration. But again, we were struggling to go back, and again, unlike very much today. Now, the this structure extended through, in fact, also different figures, the saints that could be and would be, even within the same hagiographical tradition. Think about the military saints, actually the expression of both temporal and spiritual power. Naturally, the spiritual one was more important in a sense because it belonged to the higher nature, and the temporal one is something you have, if anything, to deal because you are a fallen kind. So that's why, for example, the church cannot belong to the empire. But again, we will not talk about this today. Saints served as patrons and legal proprietors of the cathedral and monastic lands reaching to the emperor and the pope, the temporal and spiritual leaders of the Christian church and the Roman Empire, and down to the imperial vassals, whether they were dukes, archbishops, counts, or lesser nobles. This was understood in such an organic fashion that you would probably be incredibly surprised by. Today, we tend to reason just by monofactorial standards, like understanding how all these forces operated back in the day, in the present and in the past, from heaven and on earth, to contribute in the struggle for salvation, was what all these people constantly and exclusively thought about, because they were themselves in the game, right? Within this cosmic scheme, the rights associated with lordship varied widely in scope, objects, and constraints. Everybody, again, had their own place. And every condition was fundamentally accepted as this is what you deserve in the moment. Just like, again, the original sin is not something that is impressed on us. It's something that we are deliberately choosing to have, and we could simply shake off had we the actual power to divinely transcend. It's just our evil, our own constantly performed sin that actively prevents ourselves from being saved. And that's how fallen we are, how wicked we are. Right. In this system, what is important to realize is, however, there were some ordines, right? There were some estates that essentially embodied the social divide as well as the moral quality of the members. In fact, all lords were united by the sacred and inviolable essence of the hierarchy, which it was the responsibility of the senior sublunar lord, the emperor, to maintain, fulfilling his role as a supreme magistrate akin to the four sovereigns depicted on his imperial crown. This aspect is crucial because not just this was a feudal world, but it was truly exemplified as such by the power detention at the time. We've seen how Germany was, again, if we're talking about feudal terms, just in terms of how much feudally developed the system was compared to France, it's one story. But in terms of private culture, Germany had historically been deeply entrenched this lack of public authority, of statal administration. And this is in part what I was talking about before, as in moment in which it's injected in the Roman world beautifully, in Merovingian times, it sort of creates this explosive cocktail that really takes over the system. Here, Germany lacked much of that public authority as well. But on the other hand, the sense of status, of rank, right, of nobility, in this sense of a nobility metaphysical in kind, right, was perfectly embodied by the military class that, as you know, in the era, regardless of the social divides across post-Carolingian Europe, was basically transversal, right? Everybody in these countries was, as a miles, recognized as a superior being, just because his lifestyle immediately required lots of people working to have this heavily armored horseman who was capable of upkeeping his training as a military professional, and with all the effectiveness that we know. And we have discussed this just recently in this perpetual warfare, a perpetual struggle that was truly highlighted by the entire system. Think about the psychomachia. It's all about also the Bible. In the same way, again, it's all fully traditional. Outside or inside the Christian tradition, whichever these people had come from and were now meeting in together, it was all the same identical meaning of the world. Otto and Ravine, in their Gesta Friederici, observed, quote, "He would no longer be viewed as the ruler of the kingdom, but as the head and governor of a single household in a single republic." Right? So the sense is how pervasive the imperial authority technically was. If the imperial monarchy had the capacity to pursue administrative centralization that contradicted local lordship, it would have needed to challenge the beliefs in autonomous lordly rights that were foundational to aristocratic independence. At the same time, the imperium was pervasive, and the notion that the emperor was the medium with divinity was basically the hallmark of his power. So it was complicated to untangle this. Again, by just real observation, it was self-evident that the emperor did not control everything. But it was still the notion that his power, as anybody's really, was all-pervasive. Right, and so that by his own degree, of course, he wielded an incredibly important power. Unity of command is a deep strategic foundation. The sense that the Germans had been able to recover basically the imperial, imperial power in general, and wielded the Roman way to success, especially in certain very glorious pages of German monarchic history, well, did really have implications that travalicated the same German monarchy. As a matter of fact, it was in fact a Holy Roman Catholic imperial one that by definition encompassed all the world. In more strictly practical terms, however, the emperor would have had to compromise his own status as the overlord of German lords to begin with. Right? That's how his power started. He had to be elected as king of the Eastern Franks. He had eventually to be elected as king of the Romans. So a sort of double display of power, by the way, that normally came like in short subsequence, one the other. But that also at that point entailed the last step, which was this pretty big, like, say, politically, militarily, strategically, logistically, campaign that really required a great support from the people. It was very expensive, and that as such had to be performed just with a degree of ambition, right, and hopefully equal, say, imperial standards, that was ever more difficult to wield. Like, the sense is that there is not just a gradually linear increase in power. On the contrary, the closest you get to God, the more difficult it all gets, and it also does in a way which does not really admit weakness, failures, lies, and so it does, like, the higher you are at that point, the more ruinous will be the fall. Right? If only political leaders really remembered this, that from the Avest, from so many different traditions, that the notion that even a single lie can spoil literally everything in terms of the way you can receive the Holy Ghost. Well, I don't know. Like, What about, I don't know, the Russian government lying by national identity as the sole foundation of their state? Like, that's a bit difficult to reconcile with an imperial power to begin with, and they're not the only ones, of course. So that, I would say, that exemplifies how weird and ridiculous our own world is to begin with, compared to these standards here. Because, say, also the fact of being challenged as an emperor, right, at the time, did entail a level of individual exposure. Like, these rulers were knights. They were people who were constantly invested in political and military struggles that they could not escape, and that truly defined them for whom they were. So they had also much more strongly rooted sense of duty and of how to be effective that was very carefully weighed in terms of words, of actions, because again, even words per se were to embody that Wissenschaft, right? Always remember the providential meaning of the etymology wise, which is the same one of video, right? That is really a shared root of Indo-European languages, and that really exemplifies that capacity to enact the imperium in the future by your own wisdom, that is your own vision at the end of the day, with the eye of the soul, the eye of the sacred. The famous Ottonian biographer Widukind of Corvey, we discussed also in other videos regarding this very meanings. Actually, I can find you the title. The Ottonian Renovatio Imperii, Otto I, John XII, and Widukind of Corvey, Liutprand of Cremona, right? And that's exactly what we're looking at in terms of that also Saxon take on what was going on regarding the Romanity of the empire and beyond. Well, the very famous chronicler records that the dukes and other nobles paid homage collectively at Otto I's coronation in Aachen in 936, so that their public posture equated to a veritable commitment that it couldn't simply retract unless, in fact, some fundamental principle had been infringed by the emperor. Here we are, of course, in times and places. By the way, I have a video incoming on the Battle of Riade, in which, of course, there was a great support towards the Ottonian house, and that, of course, had entailed an imperial commitment, like the typically Germanism Tacitus times, like the sense that the Germans elected their leaders in times of essentially military emergency as specific commanders, right, endowed with a strategic vision, with the capacity to heroically rise. But on top of this, nobiliar power was bestowed upon them through essentially the Holy Ghost that the individual leaders, the individual chieftains had received already in virtue of themselves with God, right? It's very interesting to explain the traditional theological vision as far as that is concerned, because there's never just a single preferential way to God. So, of course, the only true emperor that could have boasted such a thing would have been not just an emperor of the world. It's essentially only God can fully achieve that. Because, again, you can be emperor of the world formally, but not practically, right? But even those, again, that wield power on their own are influenced by the emperor and do influence the emperor, so that nothing is really detached individualistically, separatistically, also in strictly political, institutional terms, from these authorities that are sacred, right? To the degree, of course, in which the divine power is obtained, but as a supreme force that you cannot, in that sense, just imagine being filtered just into one person, right? But for the mere fact of having happened in this way, entailing the worldly impact of such achievement. This is again incredibly important. That, remember, this was a world that really believed that death was just but the beginning of this journey, but that in many ways you had even just to win in death, as we explained in the video about the Mors Triumphalis, etc. So it's a dreadfully serious matter to wield power to begin with. In a similar way to Widukind of Corvey, Bishop Thietmar of Merseburg describes how Henry II, this is the last of the Ottonians, made a rapid tour of the duchies in 1002 to secure the allegiance of local nobility. During Conrad II's consecration in 1024, made a video about Conrad's reign, Vippo remarked about this practice being standard. Quote, "I find it somewhat unnecessary to mention the fealty owed to the king, for frequent occurrences indicate that all bishops, dukes, and other princes of significant rank, indeed all free-born men of importance, offer fealty to kings. In any case, all submitted to him quite sincerely and willingly by oath." This is also relevant. The realization that political unity is necessary in order to accomplish is more than a wishful thinking, right? It's just yet another thing that today we lost, right? Just think about how political decisions are fundamentally in the air until something sort of prompts you even just to act. This is basically all politics that you see today. You tend to, but this is true also for the past for that matter, but the attitude, right? The notion that, at least back in the day, you see, they lived in truly more emergential situations than ours on a regular basis, and for that reason, they knew much better how important this, authority really was in practice. The investment, again, of this individual commitment, right? This was an oath of allegiance, right? And again, it was sacred in nature. It's not, from our silly, modern, and secularized perspective, like, oh, just, this guy supported this guy, and then they don't support it anymore. It was a huge deal also for them. This was a society that was incredibly violent, as you know, but that exactly for that, for example, cared incredibly about penitence. It wasn't wishful thinking. We know from the penitentials of the era that the penalties for shedding blood, even in what was being increasingly more articulated as a just war, at least just how they thought it was at some point, it was explained before, right to kill someone for a higher purpose, were constantly and thoroughly negotiated. Right? That was not just written on a book that nobody opened. Right, literally, this involved the entire communities. People cared about the fitness of the clergy. They cared about the fitness of the military. They needed to be reassured that these people were fully committed to their duty, to their task. This is what, as we've seen, the entire process of initiation and training and dubbing of knights was all about. It was really a cult of action, a cult of taking direct full responsibility and acting really upon your own wisdom, your own capacity to will that God-given power. It was celebrated as the most important thing ever. So when a new sovereign was elected, and of course there had been a lot of negotiation about this, there were lots of people who also, here the accounts are relatively romantic, but there were lots of noblemen, as we just explained, who would simply not support these kings. And this was their shortcoming, because in theory, they should have been all fully committed, but there was a necessity in displaying, facially at least, that kind of unity. That sense, okay, let's begin the right way, let's get these things done. This was just a proposal of society that, if you look at from a contemporary standpoint, you just think to be chronically dysfunctional in terms of power wielding and issue, but that actually, in strictly in strictly traditional terms, was doing much more, right, through these human types than we do today, especially in interest of individual capacity. Now, you understand how a culture forged in this mentality was, it's just much, is helping to understand much more easily what, I don't know, just medieval Germany concretely was, right? These customs reinforced the ties between the great lords and the emperor. However, their own power was augmented by a quasi-religious or fully religious concept of lordship that conferred independent rights to each lord. Nobility, right, is essentially reflected by freedom in arms, right, this liberty in arms. This is a very strong issue. This is also what the Germans will struggle with when they will go under Frederick Barbarossa to fight against the Lombard communes, that they acknowledge the fact that whoever was, I mean, historically, this has been the foundation of Romano-Germanic, but this is really an Indo-European thing, tradition, that he who bears arms freely, and in a sense is a citizen soldier, he participates to the X-XII, he really, and also in the council, etc., is truly a nobleman, not just a freeman. But being a freeman in that sense entails a level of nobility that is intrinsically sacred in a religious sense, right? Consider that in Germany at this point, most people were not actually free, right? Most people were somebody else's people, and again, in a very sort of toxically privatistic sense. I mean, really, that sense of public authority these people had ever witnessed, I don't know, citizenship, or what it meant to be a citizen soldier, being part of a state with a professional military, with a healthy participation to political, no, right? They had always been led by aristocracies in, as we've seen historically, mostly dysfunctional fashion, and with great fatigue, the German rulers were trying to put this together and to foster a greater, for example, think about the ministeriales. The ministeriales were actually serfs, but they were given, and this is typical of Western civilization, as the lesser, as serfs really, the chance to redeem themselves and to win freedom, and or at least to, in their cases mostly, because they were very conveniently serfs in a juridical sense for their lords, but acquiring actually a much greater power than many free aristocrats, right? And in that sense, augmenting, remember always the etymology of it, that is augere in Latin, so literally it's the Augustan sense of that power increase, their own lord's power. I mean, imagine you're a German prince and you have ministeriales of yours that, so they are technically your objects, your personal property, and that they are individually more powerful than another, sometimes even than another prince, right? This did happen. It was a thing. It was part of the world of the era. And when we look at it, we simply realize that the imbalance was strong, but at the same time, the original belief in this religious power, in this capacity to equate your status on the basis of your merit was pretty alive there, right? Just was balanced in this way normally, but fighting against, for example, the Italian communes, they found out the hard way what that Romano-Germanic model of citizenry from Roman to in fact Longobards times had accomplished by standing their ground successfully also against the imperial cavalry. As a result, it became difficult for an emperor to manage rebellious lords, apart from seizing their fiefs in his role as feudal overlord. Right? I think the most famous example is the one of Frederick Barbarossa against Henry the Lion, his cousin, Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, that, as you know, at some point is literally invaded in northern Germany by Frederick, who even temporarily confiscates his own allodia. Now, I talk about the allodium that, as you know, is a concept forming in a bit, again, the mists of the Latin Germanic early Middle Ages, but that in the feudal era becomes essentially that part of your possessions that can, by definition, and I would say by conventional measure of public power, if anything, cannot be alienated. It's basically your own private property that, even though, as we said at the beginning, everything technically belongs to the emperor, as a public authority cannot be confiscated. And the measure of that, again, is that if you confiscate that land, basically the entire Germany will rise against you, because they will, this broader establishment will feel threatened. Actually, these people took over other people's lands in the process just to become noblemen, princes of the empire themselves. But again, the measure by which they could defend it was relevant, right? And in fact, Frederick at some point gives back even his the alloya to his cousin, because it would have been basically unacceptable to it. There are deeper reasons. It's actually a much more complicated thing, and we will see it in a video we will have to do about, again, Frederick and Henry. But there are other examples, right? One source of the Saxons' animosity towards Henry IV in the 1070s, which is essentially during the investiture controversy and the Saxon revolt, etc., stemmed from the belief that the emperor intended to undermine the sacred hierarchy of lords. Because remember, the regnum was considered to be sacred, right? Just like the sacerdotium, by dismantling its economic foundation and by eliminating any lords who opposed him, right? In here, again, the question is, but if these people believed really that everybody got what they deserved, like the fact that the emperor would take out some rebellious lords wasn't really normal, wasn't really acceptable in that way. Yes, it depends. Of course, there is a liminal interpretation you can make of this that goes in both ways. This is really part of the fallen condition. You can see this as those guys fell and they sort of deserved that. But there is another voice that says basically the emperor failed at the same time because he could have simply convinced them. Just if he had been just the emperor, he would have managed. The emperor meant as, again, the divine creator, etc., would have simply been able to convince these rebellious lords that there was nothing worth rebelling over, that he was actually the rightful ruler and more. That's what essentially also Christ's message is. It's not actually, it has nothing to do, people are not aware of the existence of the doctrine of the two natures, but Christ says, do not harm, do not, etc. Not because, aside from the fact that, as you know, the Old Testamentary commandment is not about killing, rather about murdering, but the supposed non-violence of Christ, that is not the case, by the way, is founded on the deep realization that if you have a spiritual power great enough to literally to transfigure the world, you don't even need to exercise violence. That's a way you can do things. It's not excluded from the picture. The Bible has practically nothing to do with that, in case you didn't realize it. And unfortunately, actually, many people haven't realized, including many Christians, self-styled Christians. It has to do with the potential, the divine potential, and so the omnipowerful potential that lays within people. Right? This is really, really, really crucial. Essentially, Henry killed somebody else, which was a sin. Why? Because just killing was a sin? Just because this emperor couldn't crush his opponents in battle? No, because this would have actually been... it's all part of what I was just saying. Even in a just war, in a crusade, etc., as most of these, by the way, were, or at least each one of these battles was about God, in the name of God, and I cannot stress this enough. If you still believe that somebody at some point invented holy war for religious purposes, say in the Crusades times, I think you really missed not just most of my work, of course, but also basically the entire meaning of mankind in a truly virtuous sense. But the point, again, is that Henry could have simply convinced his people, rather than killing life that is in itself potentially omnipowerful, right? That's the real sin. That's the limit of earthly power, of earthly rule. Maybe, again, he would have accomplished more. Here, again, we're looking at a adversarial source, and the beautiful part is how the sacred hierarchy of the lords is literally termed. But again, if you are absolutely, or if you're almost essentially God yourself, you cannot sin in that way. You would not behave that way, right? What is, again, interesting is this adjective, sacred, right? Properly, the idea that Rhenium was sacred because part of these people's, this people's power was actually part of the broader regnum, of the broader imperium, which is synonymous in the sense of the world, is because they had a merit for being lords. They had a merit for being part of that establishment. They had a merit themselves for being powerful, for being warriors, for being knights, for controlling other people, for that, as we've seen initially, would have had to simply contribute to a just rule that would have not even witnessed any kind of revolt. So you can imagine, even as a medieval ruler in general, how triggering any kind of revolt was, because it wasn't just about, okay, that those guys are idiots, they want to rebel. No, it's just the fact that it happens basically means that you are belittled by that as a man, which is terrifying, which is actually what you confront every day. Every time you fail to a degree, that you cannot whine over the fact that it's somebody else's fault. The question is, what did you do? Even to prevent something from actively being perpetrated on you. This is what, for a medieval ruler, it's incredibly clear in the rules, at least, in that we have also laws, and that why is there moral relativism to begin with? Because we've lost this point. We've lost the interdependency of responsibility. Whoever commits a sin has found someone who has let it happen, and that is sinful in the same way. So again, by law, we are not treated like this because this is an earthly human law. It's imperfect. In fact, it doesn't really quite work the way we would like to. But it has made us forget, together with the sacred, in fact, in the process, that everything that happens because we allow it. And there is really no other way, right? There is no real other interpretation. If you believe in tradition, this is the only thing that happens. You're responsible for being assassinated as much as, you're assassin, practically. And this is lost in the meaning in the mists of meaning, because, say, the extent is, what did you do in order to prevent that your life is... We are all reckless. We are all limited. We are all, at least as humans, we are really living in that deteriorated condition. The contemporary Saxon writer Bruno seemed to grasp that a decrease in regional authority in favor of some form of imperial autocracy would require the removal of those lords who would resist such change. In fact, in his book of the Saxon War, he accused Henry IV of harboring these intentions, initially targeting Duke Rudolf of Swabia, Duke Berthold of Carinthia, Archbishop Anno of Cologne, and several other bishops and key figures, right? This is particularly relevant, by the way, during the investiture controversy. I mean, here we see even prelates that the emperor wanted to remove from their position. And these are the same years in which essentially the relation with the papacy was getting more complicated, to say the least. These the upheavals in the north being deeply connected with it at the same time. Now, while the accusation may appear far-fetched, Bruno's remarks highlight the fundamentally parallel and independent nature of all German lordships. Quote, so that Henry IV might be the sole lord of everyone, he wanted no other lord to survive in his kingdom. So naturally from here we understand a narrower concept of lordship. I don't know how far in this sense Bruno was taking it, but for no lords to have been there, what should have there been? Like just Henry ruling and all the others being equally deprived of power or dead, right? Because again, lordship did manifest, as we've seen in any kind of relationship. This, of course, was mostly understood as, look, these are big, important princes of Germany. The Duke of Swabia, the one of Carinthia, made a video about both polities. Also, the Archbishop of Cologne was fundamentally most important in the picture. These are all very big figures, so that's what fundamentally seemed to be also politically more relevant. Not just because there would have been other princes, and in a sense, these were princes among others. I mean, there were higher ranks here. The dukes were more important than counts, etc. But here, Bruno was talking in terms of, like, this guy does not want any competitor whatsoever. And he did pass through these very powerful figures as well that were, of course, opposite to Henry IV for many reasons, including the historical ones of autonomization, right? But this lordship is already understood in some sort of individual way that entailed, as we've seen, that idea of sacred/noble character, which the emperor was not made to, and not meant to infringe upon, but just to convince and just to organically integrate in the hierarchy without requiring any kind of sort of oppression in that regard. And you could ask also what that could or would be, because it's not like, any relation is immune from manipulation or oppression or abuse. Every kind of relation has a minimum of that. And so one could, again, talk about different other times and connections. But I think that this is fundamentally the point. We'll keep talking, of course, about these figures, these authors, by the way, because understanding the biography of these figures makes things much easier, right? Again, today this was not just a mic testing video. Of course, we discussed important topics that are deeply intertwined with what we have already seen elsewhere, right? But sometimes we can also cover some more conceptual issues just to focus more and better on the general meaning, the deeper meaning of this. We really have to still talk about the soul of chivalry, about Ghibellinism. I see that videos are getting a bit more views recently. I'm pleased by that, of course. Sorry, I got distracted by this mic thing. Here I'm really hoping to have made work without, there isn't much that I need to take care of, but it's the first time. You must be careful. What kind of videos look at the issue a bit more closely that we made, especially about medieval Germany? Surely many of them. I don't know if you can hear me typing anymore with this one. Well, aside from the regional ones, I've seen Henry the Fabler's Eastern Frankish Kingdom is a good video for connect to this one. the Ottonian Renovatio Imperium part, yeah, that is also very important. Yeah, I mean, of course, like if you look at the German royal fisc that we talked about at the beginning, again, we made much more about this earlier period. German ministerialis legal activity partly intertwined. I mean, lots of these videos intertwine Frederick II's imperial majesty ideology. There's really a lot, again, about so many different close topics, like, for example, this one, the feudalization, again, of the German episcopal and abbatial investitures. The office of our majesty is entrusted to us by God, the role of German kingship. This is very important video as well. You named them. I mean, Conrad II, the Salient, recalled it before. There are many different videos that we can simply point. German lay princes' political affiliations, that also tells you how deeply intertwined, of course, with imperial power these figures were, especially again in a country where you have that scarce public authority in general. Otherwise, they could have never really worked. So you want to also appreciate how, in fact, functional some of this system really was in the end. Very well, however, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.